time that it takes me to complete college and obtain my PhD, some 56,000 veterans will have committed suicide. This constitutes an absolute failure in the system that has been put in place to prevent this from happening. At the end of 2017, I started a 279-day journey in the span of 2.5 years. It got me to where I am today, but there's more to do. The first thing we have to do before anything else can happen is we have to end these ongoing wars. Our service members and the military as a whole is tired, and we can no longer sustain the operational tempo that has existed over the last 20 years. In 2018, the Subcommittee on the Veterans Affairs hosted a subcommittee meeting where they interviewed the nation's leading combat psychiatrists, our military leaders, and representatives from the Veterans Administration. In closing, they offered their prayers and support to the veterans and the families that they had left behind. We don't need your prayers and support. We need action, and we need funding. The predicament we find ourselves in currently isn't really anybody's fault. It's a perfect storm of a whole bunch of independent variables coming together to create a veteran suicide epidemic. Along with 20 years of unending war, our nation entered into what's being called a critical shortage of qualified mental health providers. After we end these pointless conflicts around the world, we need to start filling the empty positions within the mental health profession. Filling these empty positions is going to take an unprecedented course of action from everyone in this country. First, we have to start changing the attitudes that the country as a whole has towards mental health, and especially within the military. The idea of mental health is basically don't ask, don't tell. You don't tell your commander or your superiors that you have a mental health condition, and they're not going to ask. When you come home from combat, you're going to be given a 10-minute briefing in which they state not to kick your dog, hit your wife, and if you get a DUI, call the unit first. That was literally my safety briefing after 1.5 years in the desert. Let that sink in. There was no mandatory screenings for potential PTSD or traumatic brain injury. We need to demand that Congress initiate incentives for veterans who are rejoining the workforce, going back to school, and who are pursuing mental health careers. Without the veteran community stepping up and helping, this is never going to happen. And lastly, we need not fill all the empty positions because we have to stop looking at this problem through 50-year-old eyes. We are not World War II veterans. We're not Vietnam veterans. We are post 9/11 veterans, and we come at this issue differently. I'm going to share a secret of my generation of veterans. We like to kill. We do. And that is the problem that haunts us. We go off to war and we enjoy it. And then we come home having seen what we are actually capable of. And then we have to find a way to live with that. Earlier generations of veterans, they went off and did their job because they had to, or because their country asked them. This is an all-volunteer force. Now, we like combat. And when we come home, we have to learn to shut that off. So the traditional treatment options that are out there, while can be successful, have obviously failed because the numbers speak to the success of the current state of psychiatry approach is when it comes to veterans and PTSD. This photo that I took in 2007 in Camp Bucca, Iraq, is kind of the epitome of how successful the treatment options are for veterans coming home. Both of these soldiers have taken their own lives. Let that sink in for a second. What you need to understand is that 56,000 veterans that commit suicide in the time that it takes me to get my PhD, that represents only the completed suicides. These numbers do not take into consideration any of the attempted. And there are tens of thousands of attempted suicides every month. Because as it turns out, the 22 a day casualty rate actually includes active duty service members. Those actively wearing the uniform commit suicide every day. We are the greatest military this world has ever seen. And we cannot create a program to keep our service members from killing themselves in record numbers. We have to demand that DC take action. Congress has to allocate funds, form initiatives, and attempt to combat this epidemic at every turn. So contact your congressman and tell them to end these 20-year-old wars, but most importantly, educate yourself. The reason that this has been going on for so long is that it is a silent epidemic. Ask yourself, before you heard this speech, did you know that 22 veterans a day are committing suicide? This affects millions of people across this country every year. We have to educate ourselves, or this silent, unknown epidemic will continue. This is what America sees. This is what the average citizen sees. They see the shining soldier or Marine, Navy, or Air Force, even the Space Force now, saluting the flag. The problem is, if you look deep enough, just under the surface, if you pull back the curtain, you see what's really going on. The veteran community is hurting. And 22 veterans a day commit suicide.